Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 31 of Gunnerkrigg Court, Fire Spike. Now, this chapter is a bit tough to talk about because a lot of key stuff happens in it, and instead of just narrating the whole thing and describing what's going on in the pages, I thought I'd just talk about some of the technical aspects of it, and talk about the plot if I feel it's important. And like a few of the larger chapters in the past, this chapter, to me, signifies a turning point in the story and Annie's development. And it starts off with a couple of things that we'd not really seen before. The first of which being Renard in his regular fox form, interacting and talking normally with Surma, but also Annie learning that Surma perhaps wasn't quite as saintly as she thought she was. Just briefly we learned that Surma and the court colluded together to trick Renard into being captured. And while Annie doesn't really react to this, we see that she's perhaps not too happy about it. And that adds to something that I've been building up to this point and was going to bring to a head in this chapter. And another thing about this chapter is that it is one of the points where I decided to change a little bit of my drawing style. You can sort of see here on this panel that I was using very thick lines for Annie's hair, and I think that was a direction that I was heading in general with the artwork of the comic. But this chapter is really the last time where I would use such defined lines like that, and I felt more comfortable, I think, using thinner lines in general and changing the style slightly in a way that you won't really see very much until the beginning of the next chapter. And I felt I had to make that change at this point because I began to feel that I was thinking of Annie's hair more as a solid shape rather than a mass of actual hair. And so it felt like it was becoming a bit unnatural the way I was drawing it. And that might seem like a small change to make artistically, but something like that, at least when I do it, tends to lead to a lot of smaller changes elsewhere. But that's something I'll get onto when the next chapter begins. Here at this part where Annie meets Jack, this is an area of the school that we've actually seen in the past based on an old patio area where my friends and I used to hang out during lunchtime and break times back in my old school. It's actually an area that doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by some new school buildings from the time, but I thought it'd be an appropriate place to include in the comic. And on this panel here we can see in the background this door led directly to my form room. And I guess ultimately details like this don't really add anything to the comic, especially if it's a detail that only really myself is going to recognize. But there's something about adding background detail like this to these sorts of scenes that makes working on this sort of scene a bit more enjoyable for me. But something else we see on this scene here is that even though Annie has done a lot of growing and changing over the past few chapters, she's still pretty awkward in her interaction. But throughout this whole first part of the chapter, there's supposed to be something a little bit off about Annie and the way she's acting. And after finishing her meeting with Jack, she goes straight to Kat's room and takes her homework book. And this is just a small reference to something that we've seen in the past, in which Annie has probably gotten into the habit of copying Kat's homework. And it's something that Renard is picking up on. And when he confronts Annie about it, it just leads to her getting even more angry and eventually snapping and saying something really mean to Renard. I guess what I was trying to do at this point was show that Annie had been hearing lots of conflicting things about her parents, and she'd gotten to the point where she's just had enough either having to defend her dad or listen to stories about her mother. And at this point, Renard's comments and getting on her back about her homework just led to Annie finally snapping. And one visual cue I give to showing that Annie is becoming a bit less together and in control of herself, I just draw her hair get slightly messy. And I just thought it was quite a nice visual cue that eventually readers also picked up on, to show that Annie was probably losing a bit of self-control without actually having to show any change in expression or make her say anything in particular. But she tries to regain some composure, and eventually ends up saying something that very much hurts Renard, and he ends up lashing out. And this is really the first time that we learn the circumstances for Surma's death and how Annie is pretty much directly related to it. But here, once Annie gets really upset, I wanted to try and convey the emotion that she was just stumbling blindly through the court and not really able to think straight, like her head is swimming with emotion, and it was quite fun to draw these backgrounds with all these twisted, bended lines and buildings and stuff, and even the panels of the comic itself start to warp and change. But now we're in the forest again, and Annie and Nasengrin meet up and chat for a little while. And as I said before, instead of just narrating what happens in the comic here, which is pretty self-explanatory if you were to read the pages, I guess I could say a brief word about what I wanted to do with this chapter. And I guess what I was trying to convey here was the feeling of a younger person who felt pretty hard done by and felt the weight of the world on their shoulders and lashing out and eventually causing a few mistakes. Of course, what she found out about her mom has led her to become upset, and you can't really blame a teenager for lashing out and doing something impulsive like running into the forest, even though it's been shown that she's strictly forbidden to do that. And what I wanted to show here was that Annie is surrounded by three people of whom her personal problems couldn't be any less of a concern. We have Jones, who's coldly trying to point out to Annie that she's making a mistake and putting people in danger, and we then have Coyote, who just makes light of the whole situation, and even though he does convey some important information, we see that the only one out of the three that actually offers Annie any emotional support is Isengrin, which we'll see in a moment. It was supposed to be mildly ironic that the people who would have been best prepared to help Annie with her emotional problems were the exact people that she ran away from earlier on in the chapter. But in the meantime, we get a bit of information about Annie and Surma, and some hints as to Annie's disposition. We start to learn about the fire elemental side of her personality, and we also get an invitation from Coyote for Annie to stay in the forest during the summer. And while Annie takes it as an invitation to stay at a fun summer camp, Jones doesn't hesitate to tell her that her decision has put a lot of people at the court in danger, because Annie had no idea that Coyote wouldn't become angry at learning that Renard was intentionally trapped in the court, or that Coyote may have reacted in some different way. And not only that, but once Annie agrees to stay, we have this short scene here where Coyote stops time and tells her in no uncertain terms that if he doesn't follow what he says, that she will come to serious harm. This was supposed to leave Annie and the readers, I guess, with a feeling of unease. We have this scene here, which is one of the scenes that I kind of enjoy in the comic, because it shows a bit more of Isengrin and Annie's relationship. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, Isengrin is the only one to really offer Annie any emotional support, but he does it in such a way that is in keeping with his character. He doesn't try to coddle her or try to mislead her in any way. He says outright that the reason she lashed out was because she was weak, and this is why she ran away. But I suppose in Isengrin's mind, everything starts as weak, and all they can do is strive to become stronger. Even if you have to take the personal experiences that have made you feel low or inadequate and use those as experience to make yourself a stronger person. And Isengrin is definitely someone who wouldn't encourage feeling sorry for oneself and wallowing in one's own self-pity. And while that isn't to say that that is always a bad thing to do, I wanted to portray that here as something that would be very in keeping with Isengrin's character and the sort of advice that he would impart. And later on in the comic, we see that not all of Isengrin's advice that Annie follows is always to her benefit. But at this moment, it's what Annie needed to hear. And the end of this chapter, where Annie walks into the vague green glowiness of the forest, which actually ended up being the end of book 3, I drew this scene as if it was leading up to a big reveal that would show the forest villagers and where Annie would be spending for the summer. But instead I decided to focus entirely on Annie, because that's the whole point of the chapter. It's not really important what she sees or what she goes on to experience. I just wanted to visually represent Annie pressing forward into something unknown. And even though her hair and her emotions are still a mess, and the threat the Coyote placed on her is first and foremost in the page, she still has a Isengrin at her back, and she's looking forward unafraid of what's in front of her. And since this is where the book ends, we don't actually see what goes on in the forest over her summer break, because I eventually made that the subject of 2 side comics that don't really fit into the main story, and are collected in the extra comics section of the Gunnerkrigg website. But instead of going into those, I'll continue on with the regular chapters of the main story. And since this is the end of the book, the bonus page in this case is another treatise page, with a few of the similar themes, the sun and the moon, and both Annie and Cat in the middle of the picture. This time, though, they're both facing away from each other. Cat is facing into the court, with the robots all watching her. But now Annie is facing fully towards the forest, with Isengrin looming over her. And Coyote is sort of pushed a little bit into the background. We have these vines coming from the forest and wrapping around her arm, just to show the pull of the forest on her, and her interest in discovering a bit more of herself, as shown by the fire at the ends of her hair leading again into the forest. But despite all this, we have her hair wrapping around behind the image, and tying itself very firmly around Cat's arm, because Cat really is the anchor that keeps her there at the court. And of course there's a bunch of extra stuff in these pages that I won't explicitly spell out, because it's there for people to take a look at and interpret in various ways. And that's that. Come back again for chapter 32, From the Forest She Came.